In the port of Savannah, we don't value gold. Gold is soft. We value leverage. Most people see a broken man and see a liability, a debt that will never be paid. When the Gordio Ironworks defaulted on their blood tax, they didn't send me a check. They sent me Jun-ho, a disgraced prince with poet's hands and a heart full of glass. They thought they were dumping their trash in my yard. They were wrong. They didn't give me a victim. They gave me the raw ore. I spent a year breaking what was left of his spirit so I could forge something indestructible. I turned that broken prince into a weapon that doesn't feel, doesn't blink, and doesn't miss. Now the debt is due, and I'm sending him back to collect it from his own blood. Welcome back to Elysia's Love Codex. Today, we are stepping away from the fairy tales and into the salt-stained reality of the Savannah docks. In this world, emotional attachment isn't a reward, it's a death sentence. In this story, you're going to witness a brutal game of survival and shifting influence. We're following the rise of a matriarch who plays the long game and a prince who must undergo a total erasure of his past just to survive his future. Expect high-stakes tension, irreversible losses, and a look at what happens when the person who saved you is actually the one holding the leash. Hold on tight. This is They Gave Me a Broken Prince. I Turned Him into a Weapon. Are you ready? They say grief makes you soft. They're wrong. Grief is a whetstone. 10 years ago, I buried my husband and my son because they weren't fast enough, they weren't hard enough. I watched the life go out of them while my own hand went cold and useless. I thought I was finished, until the Gordio family handed me their trash. They gave me a broken prince with a scholar's heart, a boy who looked exactly like the one I lost. But I'm not his mother. I'm his architect. I'm going to give him the teeth my son never had. I'm going to make him a weapon so sharp that even the people who murdered my past won't see him coming. This isn't about debt anymore. This is about making sure that this time, the boy survives the world I built. The asphalt of the Savannah port didn't just hold the heat, it radiated it back like a living thing, shimmering in oily waves that blurred the line between the sky and the rusted iron of the Gordio border. Matriarch Sloane stood at the edge of the dead zone, her boots clicking against the sun-bleached concrete. She didn't mind the heat. The heat was honest. It was the coldness in her left hand, tucked away in its black leather glove, that she couldn't stand. That hand remained at a permanent winter chill, the nerves long ago severed in an ambush that had turned her world to ash. Every few seconds, the ghost of a smaller, warmer hand seemed to brush against her palm, a memory of her son, CJ, on the day he didn't come home. Across the white line of the border, a Gordio transport truck hissed as its air brakes released. The doors didn't open. They were pried. There was no dignity in this transaction, no silk-lined cars or diplomatic handshakes. This was a liquidation. Silkhan stepped out first, her white suit a blinding, arrogant contrast to the industrial decay around them. She looked at Sloane with the pity of a woman who had already won, then signaled to the men behind her. They didn't lead the passenger out. They dragged a heavy, reinforced steel crate to the edge of the flatbed and kicked it onto the concrete with a bone-jarring thud. The interest on the saltwater pact, Silk said, her voice cutting through the humid air. My father says he's tired of the clutter. Take him. He's spent his life reading books and weeping over ink washes. He's useless to us. Maybe you can find a use for a prince who can't hold a sword without trembling. Sloane didn't look at Silk. She walked toward the crate, her right hand resting on the hilt of the cane she used more for rhythm than support. When her enforcers crowbarred the lid, the boy inside didn't fight. He cowered. Jun-ho was wrapped in tattered ceremonial robes, his face bruised and his eyes wide with a terror so familiar it made Sloane's breath catch in her throat. Those were CJ's eyes. They were the eyes of a boy who believed the world was a place of logic and kindness, right up until the moment it tore him apart. "Get up," Sloane commanded. Her voice was like the grinding of tectonic plates, slow and heavy. Junho looked up at her, his lips parched and white with salt. "Please," he whispered. "I didn't know. I didn't have anything to do with the ship. I was in Seoul. I was studying." "Studying doesn't pay for sunken tugboats," Sloane said, stepping closer. She reached down with her gloved hand, the stiff, unmoving fingers catching under his chin to force his head up. He flinched at the coldness of the leather. She stared into his soul, searching for the spark of the boy she had lost. But all she found was the same fatal softness. It was a weakness that had cost her everything. A husband who thought he could negotiate with monsters, and a son who thought a shield was enough to stop a bullet. Silkan laughed from the safety of the borderline. "He's all yours, matriarch. Try not to break him too quickly. He's quite fragile." Sloane watched the Goreo truck pull away, leaving the boy shivering on the blistering asphalt in the middle of a 100-degree afternoon. She looked at his hands. They were long, slender, and unmarred by labor. Hands meant for poetry, for music, for things that didn't survive in the savannah wind. She hated those hands. They were a reminder of every moment she had spent trying to shield her own family from the grime of the syndicate, only to have that protection become their shroud. "You think you're a victim, Junho?" she asked, her gaze moving from the horizon back to the trembling boy. I just want to go home," he choked out, a single tear cutting a trail through the dust on his cheek. Sloane felt a spike of genuine, crystalline rage. She leaned down, her face inches from his. "Home is gone. Your sister sold the deed to your life to pay for a mistake she made. Your father signed the papers before the ink on your diploma was dry. You aren't a prince anymore. You're an indemnity. You're a debt I'm going to collect in blood." She signaled to Marcus, who stood by the black SUV with a look of disgusted boredom. He approached and hauled Junho to his feet with a violence that was unnecessary, but Sloane didn't stop him. The boy needed to learn the weight of a hand that didn't love him. Marcus shoved him toward the vehicle, but Junho stumbled, his legs weak from days in the crate. He fell, his palms scraping against the rough concrete, drawing a thin line of red. Sloane stood over him, shadows lengthening across the docks. "My son died because he thought someone would show him mercy if he fell," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that only Junho could hear. "My husband died because he believed a man's word was his bond. They were soft. They were broken. And I let them stay that way." She looked at her gloved, paralyzed hand. It was a dead weight, a permanent anchor to a day she couldn't change. But as she looked at Junho, she saw a second chance written in his fear. She wouldn't make the same mistake twice. She wouldn't love this boy. She would forge him. She wouldn't protect him. She would make him the thing everyone else needed protection from. "Look at me," she snapped. Junho raised his head, his chest heaving with silent sobs. "You have poet's hands, Junho. Tomorrow, I start the process of taking them away from you. By the time I'm done, you won't be able to write a single line of verse. But you'll be able to cut the breath out of a man's throat before he hears your heartbeat. You think they gave me a broken prince? No. They gave me the steel I've been waiting 10 years to sharpen." She turned and walked toward the car, her gait steady and rhythmic. Behind her, Marcus dragged the boy toward the dark interior of the SUV. Junho looked back at the Gordeo border one last time, but there was nothing there but the shimmering heat and the empty road. The life he knew was an irreversible loss, a ghost already fading in the savannah sun. As the car door slammed shut, the silence of the docks returned, heavy and expectant. Sloane sat in the back, the air conditioning doing nothing to warm her left hand. She watched the back of Junho's head, her mind already calculating the hours of training, the chemical focus regimens, and the surgical precision required to turn a scholar into a killer. She had found her purpose in the wreckage of another woman's brother. She would build the weapon her family had lacked, and when it was finished, she would finally find out who had turned her hand cold. The drive back to the Onyx hub was silent, save for the sound of the tires humming over the salt-cracked road. Junho pressed his forehead against the glass, watching the rusted cranes pass by like sentinels. He didn't know it yet, but the boy who had read poetry and soul was already dead. In his place, something else was beginning to stir. A hollow space where his soul used to be, waiting to be filled with the weight of Sloane's dual blades. Sloane closed her eyes, the phantom warmth of her son's hand finally flickering out. "Welcome to the Syndicate, Junho," she whispered into the dark. "Try to survive the night. The morning belongs to me." The training floor of the Onyx Central Hub was a cathedral of corrugated steel and shadow, smelling of ozone and the sharp medicinal tang of the focus serum. Matriarch Sloane sat in her elevated control chair, her black-gloved hand resting motionless on her lap, while her right adjusted the dials on a medical monitor. Below her, Junho was strapped into a high-backed chair, his arms bared to reveal the roadmap of veins that pulsed with a dull amber light. This was the second day of his recalibration, and the soft boy who had arrived in a crate was being replaced, layer by agonizing layer, by something built for utility. The surgical repairs to his hands had been the easy part. The real work was the chemical bridge she was building between his mind and his muscles. "Focus, Junho." Sloane's voice echoed through the rafters, stripped of any comfort. "The serum doesn't give you strength. It removes the hesitation. It burns away the part of you that asks why before you strike." Junho's head lolled back, sweat matting his dark hair against his forehead. His eyes, once a deep, soulful brown, were now clouded with that artificial amber hue, the primary side effect of the Syndicate's combat stimulants. He looked up at Sloane, his vision swimming. Through the haze of the drug, she looked like a gargoyle carved from gray stone, ancient and immovable. He tried to remember the rhythm of a poem he had once loved, something about the spring rain and soul. But the words felt like sand slipping through his fingers. Whenever he tried to reach for a memory of his mother, or the quiet library where he had spent his youth, a sharp, electric spike of pain shot through his temples. Sloane watched the biorhythms on her screen. She saw the moment his pulse spiked as he tried to cling to his past, and she dialed the serum dosage higher. She wasn't just training him. She was pruning him. Every memory of his former life was a branch that drew energy away from the blade. She remembered CJ's face the night he died, how he had frozen, his eyes wide and pleading, looking for a way to talk his way out of a bullet. He had been too full of life, too full of dreams, and it had made him slow. She would not let Junho be slow. She would make him a void. Unbind him, Sloane commanded. Marcus stepped out of the shadows, his face a mask of simmering resentment. He unlatched the restraints with a violent jerk, allowing Junho to slump forward onto the concrete floor. Junho's breath came in ragged gasps, his fingers twitching rhythmically, a nervous tic from the surgery. Marcus kicked a pair of weighted wooden training swords toward him. The heavy oak clattered against the floor, a sound that seemed to reverberate like a gunshot in Junho's heightened state. "Pick them up," Marcus sneered, his voice dripping with the bitterness of a son who had been passed over for a stranger. "Or don't. I'd prefer to just toss you back into the marsh and tell my mother the serum fried your brain. It would save us both a lot of time." Junho reached for the hilts. His fingers, now reinforced with carbon fiber pins beneath the skin, felt alien to him. They were too steady, too precise. When his hands closed around the wood, the trembling stopped instantly. It was as if the swords were the only things keeping him grounded in reality. He stood up, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a marionette being pulled by invisible wires. Sloane stood up from her chair and walked down the steel staircase, the rhythmic thud-click of her cane and boots marking the seconds. She stopped 3 paces from him, her black-gloved hand tucked behind her back. "My husband thought the world was a game of chess," she said, her eyes fixed on Junho's amber gaze. "He thought if he moved the right pieces and spoke the right words, everyone could leave the table alive. He was a fool. The world isn't a board. It's a furnace. You either become the heat or you become the ash." She suddenly lashed out with her cane, the heavy mahogany striking Junho across the ribs. He went down hard, gasping for air, the wooden swords clattering away. "Again," she said. For the next 3 hours, the only sounds in the warehouse were the strikes of the cane and the heavy, wet thud of Junho hitting the concrete. Marcus watched from the periphery, his hand hovering over the pistol at his hip, his eyes tracing the way his mother looked at the boy. She didn't look at him with love, but with a terrifying, religious intensity. She was looking at a masterpiece in progress. Every time Junho failed to block, she struck him. Every time he tried to apologize, she struck him harder. "The pain is a teacher, Junho," Sloane whispered as he struggled to his knees for the 20th time. "It's the only thing that's truly yours in this port. Feel it. Map it. Use it to find the rhythm of the men who want to kill you." Something shifted in Junho then. Perhaps it was the serum finally reaching its peak saturation, or perhaps it was the sheer exhaustion of being a person. He stopped trying to stand up like a man and began to move like a machine. When Sloane swung the cane again, he didn't flinch. He didn't think. His right hand shot out, the wooden sword intercepting the mahogany with a sharp crack. Before Sloane could retract, his left hand swung upward, the second sword stopping a fraction of an inch from her throat. The silence that followed was absolute. Marcus stepped forward, his face flushed with rage. But Sloane raised her right hand to stay him. She looked at the wooden tip pressed against her carotid artery, then up at Junho. His eyes were wide, but they weren't fearful anymore. They were empty. The focus had taken hold. He wasn't looking at her as a woman or a captor. He was looking at her as a target. "Good," she breathed, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, the first since the night of the ambush. She reached out with her black-gloved hand and slowly pushed the wooden blade away. Junho didn't resist. He stood there, his chest heaving, his muscles coiled like a spring. The paralysis in her own hand felt heavier in that moment, a reminder of what she could no longer do. But the boy in front of her was the answer to her prayers. He was the speed she had lost. He was the steel she couldn't hold. "You see that, Marcus?" Sloane said, not taking her eyes off the prince. "The scholar is dead. There's nothing left in there but the debt." She turned to Junho and placed her right hand on his shoulder. It was the first time she had touched him without violence, but it wasn't an embrace. It was the way a soldier might check the weight of a rifle. "Go to your cell. Rest. Tomorrow, we move from wood to steel. Tomorrow, you stop being a prince and start being a shadow." Junho dropped the wooden swords. He didn't say a word. He didn't look at Marcus or the exit. He simply turned and walked toward the small, windowless room that had become his world. His gait was no longer the hesitant shuffle of a student. It was the predatory glide of a weapon being returned to its sheath. Sloane stood in the center of the warehouse, watching him go. The phantom weight of her son's hand didn't return this time. Instead, she felt a cold, sharp clarity. She had taken a broken thing and found the edge hidden inside the cracks. As the lights in the hub flickered off one by one, leaving her in the twilight of the Savannah docks, she looked at her gloved hand and finally felt a sense of peace. The boy was gone. The weapon was ready. And soon, the people who had made her world go cold would find out what happened when a matriarch decided to stop grieving and start hunting. The smell of low tide in the Savannah port always heralded a specific kind of violence. It was a thick, sulfurous rot that clung to the back of the throat, reminding those who lived in the shadow of the cranes that everything eventually sank. Junho sat in the back of a blacked-out transport van, his dual katanas resting across his knees. The amber glow in his eyes was more pronounced in the dim interior, pulsing in time with the mechanical thrum of the engine. He didn't feel the humidity. He didn't feel the nerves that should have been screaming in his gut. The focus serum had smoothed out the jagged edges of his humanity, leaving behind a cold, analytical silence. Matriarch Sloane sat across from him, her face partially obscured by the shadows. She was dressed in her charcoal gray workwear, the black leather glove on her left hand resting on the head of her cane. She was watching him, not with the pride of a mentor, but with the calculated scrutiny of an engineer checking the calibration of a machine. "The safe house is a front for the ironworks offshore accounts," Sloane said, her voice cutting through the hum of the van. "It's a colonial-style house on the edge of the marsh. My people have cut the power. You have 6 minutes to enter, retrieve the ledger from the second-floor study, and exit. Anyone inside is a witness. A witness is a liability." Junho nodded once. The movement was sharp, lacking the fluid grace of his former life. "They'll be your people, Junho," she added, her voice dropping an octave, testing the strength of the chemical shackles she'd placed on his mind. "Men you played cards with in Seoul. Men who likely served your father for 20 years. Do you remember their names?" Junho looked at the blades on his lap. He reached for a name, a face, a memory of a shared meal or a joke told in his father's garden. He found only gray static. The seer was a hungry thing. It fed on the past to power the present. "Names don't balance the ledger," he said. His voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, hollow and metallic. Sloane felt a flicker of satisfaction that, across years, her heart. She remembered the way her son had hesitated when he saw the face of the man who had come to kill them. A man who had once been their gardener. That hesitation had cost her husband his life. She had vowed that Junho would never suffer from the same affliction. The van slowed to a crawl and the rear doors hissed open. The marsh air rushed in, heavy and wet. Sloane stayed in her seat, her silhouette framed by the interior light. "Don't come back without the ledger. And Junho, if you find your heart beating too fast, remember the crate. Remember the silence of the people who sold you." He stepped out into the night, moving with the predatory glide he had learned on the concrete floors of the Onyx hub. The house was a white-pillared ghost in the middle of the dark marshland. There were no lights, but his amber-tinted vision rendered the world in high-contrast shades of gray and gold. He moved through the tall grass without a sound, the dual swords already in his hands. He entered through a side window, his boots landing silently on the polished hardwood. The air inside smelled of expensive tobacco and old paper, the scent of his father's world. He moved toward the stairs, but a floorboard creaked behind him. "Who's there?" a voice whispered in Korean. It was a young voice, trembling with a fear that Junho vaguely recognized as his own from a lifetime ago. Junho turned. A man stood at the end of the hallway, holding a flashlight that shook in his grip. The light hit Junho's face, reflecting off the amber in his eyes. The man gasped, dropping the light. "Junho? Prince Junho, is that you?" The man took a step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "It's Min Q. I was your tutor's son. We thought you were dead. Thank the gods. We have to get you out of here. If the matriarch finds out you're—" Junho didn't wait for him to finish. The focus surged, a white-hot spark at the base of his skull that translated the man's movement into a series of tactical openings. He didn't see Min Q, the boy he had once shared tea with. He saw a target. He moved. The first blade opened the man's throat before he could even register the motion. The second blade found his heart. There was no sound but the wet thud of the body hitting the floor. Junho stood over him, his blades dripping onto the expensive rug. He waited for the wave of grief, the scream of his conscience, the vomit in the back of his throat. Nothing came. The ledger was the mission. The mission was the utility. He moved up the stairs with mechanical efficiency. In the study, he found an older man, the chairman's former secretary, trying to burn documents in the fireplace. The man looked up, his eyes widening as he recognized the prince. He began to beg, tears streaming down his wrinkled face, reaching out a hand to touch Junho's sleeve. Junho didn't listen to the words. Words were soft. Words were what his father used to lie to the matriarch. He retrieved the ledger from the desk and, with a single, clinical strike, silenced the secretary mid-sentence. When he emerged from the house 5 minutes later, the ledger was tucked securely under his arm. He walked back to the van where Sloane was waiting. She was standing outside now, leaning on her cane, her black-gloved hand resting on the open door. She looked at the blood on his sleeves, then at the ledger, and finally into his empty, glowing eyes. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked. "The objective is secured," he replied. "And the witnesses?" "Liquidated." Sloane reached out her right hand and brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. It was a maternal gesture, but her eyes were cold and triumphant. She had done it. She had corrected the flaw. She had built a son who would never hesitate, a weapon that would never break in the hand that held it. "Good," she whispered. "Now you know what you are. You're the price they paid. And you're just getting started." As they drove away, leaving the silent house behind them, Jun-ho looked at his hands. They were steady. They were strong. They were the hands of a weapon. But somewhere deep beneath the chemical fog, in a place the serum hadn't quite burned away yet, a small, quiet part of him realized that the boy who loved poetry wouldn't just be missed. He would be the first ghost to haunt the weapon he had become. Sloane sat back in the darkness of the van, her paralyzed hand feeling lighter than it had in years. The debt was being paid, one life at a time. And the boy she had lost was finally being replaced by a shadow that would never let her down. The port of Savannah watched them pass, its rusted cranes bowing in the dark, like mourners at a funeral for a soul that no longer existed. The shadows in the Onyx hub didn't just hide secrets. They harbored a rot that smelled like stale sweat and jealousy. Marcus Sloane stood on the high catwalk, his knuckles white as he gripped the rusted railing, looking down at the training floor. Below, the prince moved in a terrifyingly fluid sequence, his katanas carving arcs through the air that were too fast for the human eye to track. Every time Junho's blades whistled through the air, Marcus felt a phantom sting in his own side, a reminder of the mother who had looked through him for 30 years, searching for a precision he never possessed. To Marcus, Junho wasn't an asset. He was a mirror reflecting his own inadequacy, a replacement parts bin for a family that was already dead. Matriarch Sloane sat in her usual station, her black-gloved hand resting on the console, her eyes tracking Junho's every footfall. She didn't acknowledge Marcus's presence, though the heavy, uneven rhythm of his breathing was loud enough to echo in the rafters. She was focused on the amber glow in Junho's eyes, which was flickering. The focus was stabilizing, but the boy was beginning to adapt to the dosage. He was becoming a shadow that moved on instinct, but Marcus was determined to prove that a shadow could still be stepped on. "He's a stray dog, Ma," Marcus finally spat, his voice echoing off the corrugated steel. "You've spent more on his surgeries and serums than we made on the last 3 shipments from the ironworks. And for what? So he can play dress-up with Goryo Steel?" Sloane didn't turn around. Her voice was a low, dangerous hum. "He's a tool, Marcus. Tools require investment. You, on the other hand, are an inheritance. And like most inheritances, you're currently depreciating in value." Marcus's face flushed a violent shade of red. He descended the stairs, his limp more pronounced in his agitation. He walked straight onto the training floor, ignoring the way Junho didn't even break his stance. The prince didn't look at him. He didn't look at anything. He was simply waiting for the next command, his blades held in a low, defensive cross. "A tool is only good if it works when it's supposed to," Marcus said, stopping just outside the reach of the blades. "I heard about the safe house. I heard he killed old men and tutors. Real brave. Let's see how he handles a real threat. Let's see how he handles the man who's actually going to run this port one day." "Marcus, back away," Sloane said, her voice dropping into a register that usually signaled a death warrant. But Marcus was past listening. He drew his sidearm, a customized Syndicate issue .45, and aimed it directly at Junho's forehead. "Come on, Prince. Show me that focus. Show me the weapon my mother loves so much. Move before I pull the trigger." Junho didn't blink. The amber in his eyes deepened, a sign the serum was flooding his system in response to the threat. He didn't feel fear. He felt a series of mathematical probabilities. The distance was 6 feet. The muzzle velocity was fixed. The trigger pull would take 0.2 seconds. Under the fog of the drug, Junho was already calculating the lean of his torso and the angle of his blade to deflect the casing. But beneath that, in the small, dark corner of his mind that Sloane hadn't managed to erase, he recognized the name Marcus had used. Prince. It was a word from a dream he couldn't quite remember, a title for a boy who was buried under the savannah salt. "I said move!" Marcus screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger. The air in the hub seemed to freeze. Sloane didn't move to stop him. She sat perfectly still, her right hand hovering over the emergency shutoff for the focus vents. But she didn't press it. This was a trial. If the weapon broke now, it was better to know. Just as Marcus's knuckle turned white against the trigger, the warehouse's main alarm began to wail, a jagged, piercing sound that signaled a breach in the perimeter. The heavy steel doors at the far end of the hub shuddered under a massive impact. "The ironworks," Marcus hissed, his focus breaking as he glanced toward the door. It was the opening Junho's programming had been waiting for. He didn't think. He simply executed. In one motion, he closed the gap. His left hand moved in a blur, his palm striking the underside of Marcus's wrist, sending the gun flying upward. His right hand brought the flat of the katana down on Marcus's shoulder, a strike meant to incapacitate, not kill. Marcus went down with a cry of pain and shock, hitting the concrete as his pistol clattered into the darkness. Junho stood over him, the tip of his blade hovering an inch from Marcus's throat. There was no anger in his face, only a terrifying, vacant readiness. "Enough!" Sloane's voice boomed. She walked down to the floor, her cane clicking with a sharp finality. She looked down at Marcus, who was clutching his shoulder, then up at Junho. "He's not the mission, Junho. Stand down." Junho retracted the blade instantly, returning to his neutral stance. The amber in his eyes began to recede, leaving him looking exhausted and hollowed out. Sloane turned her attention to the breach. "Sil Khan is getting desperate. She's sending her hunters into my yard to see if the rumors are true. She wants to see if her brother is still alive, or if I've turned him into the ghost she fears." She looked at Marcus, her eyes full of a cold, blistering contempt. "Get up. You wanted to see the weapon in action? Now you're going to help him clean up the mess you nearly made. If a single ironworks soldier leaves this dock alive, I'll consider your inheritance settled." Marcus scrambled to his feet, his face pale, his bravado shattered. He grabbed his gun from the floor, casting a look of pure, unadulterated hatred at Junho. He realized then that he couldn't kill the prince with a bullet. Not yet. He would have to kill the matriarch's faith in him instead. As the sirens continued to wail and the sound of goreo boots echoed in the loading bays, Sloane stepped back into the shadows. She watched her son and her weapon prepare for the coming slaughter. She knew that Sil Khan didn't want a rescue. She wanted a confirmation. She wanted to know if the boy she sold was truly gone. "Jun-ho!" Sloane called out over the noise. The prince turned, his face a blank mask of amber and shadow. "No survivors," she said. "Remind your sister why the port of Savannah belongs to the Onyx." Jun-ho didn't respond with words. He simply gripped his hilts and melted into the darkness of the shipping containers. A silent, dual-bladed ghost. Marcus followed, his limp heavy and vengeful, a poisoned crown waiting for its moment to strike. Sloane stood alone in the center of the training floor, her paralyzed hand twitching for the first time in years. It wasn't a sign of healing. It was a sign of the storm. The debt was no longer just about money or ships. It was about the blood that was currently staining the concrete, and the secrets that were about to be dragged out of the marsh. The night was just beginning, and in the port of Savannah, the only thing more dangerous than a weapon was the person who thought they could control it. The damp heat of the Savannah night was beginning to break, replaced by a thick rolling fog that swallowed the gantry cranes and turned the Onyx hub into an island of rusted iron. Inside the secure medical wing, the air was sterilized and cold. Matriarch Sloane sat by the window, watching the mist press against the glass. In her right hand, she held a faded, water-damaged photograph of her husband and CJ. Their smiles frozen in a world that had existed before the salt took them. In her left, the black-gloved hand sat like a lead weight on her lap. For the first time in a decade, the phantom chill in her fingers was being replaced by a sharp, rhythmic throbbing, the kind of pain that only comes when a wound is being reopened. Jun-ho lay on the examination table, his chest rising and falling in the slow, mechanical cadence of the focus sleep. The serum was being flushed from his system, replaced by a stabilizing nutrient drip, but his eyes remained partially open, the amber tint refusing to fade. He was dreaming, though the dreams were no longer his own. They were fragmented images of white pillars and blood-stained rugs, interspersed with the recurring image of a woman in a white suit standing over a sinking ship. "He's adapting too fast, Mother," Marcus said, stepping into the room. He didn't look at Jun-ho. He kept his eyes on the floor, his shoulders still stiff from the blow he'd taken earlier. "The enforcers are talking. They're calling him the Ghost of the Docks. They say he moves like a Goryeo assassin, but thinks like an Onyx Reaper. It's making the men nervous." "Let them be nervous," Sloane replied, her voice a low, raspy velvet. "Nervous men stay sharp. Complacent men get buried." "It's more than that," Marcus pushed, his voice trembling with a cocktail of fear and repressed fury. "Silk Han didn't send those hunters to kill us. She sent them to deliver a message. One of the men we captured before Jun-ho finished him, he said something. He said the ironworks didn't sink our tugboat 10 years ago. He said the accident was an inside job, a deal made by someone who wanted your husband out of the way so the Saltwater Pact could be rewritten." Sloane turned slowly, the photograph crinkling in her grip. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "And you believe a dying man's lies, Marcus? You think the Goryeo bloodline has a monopoly on the truth?" "I think we've been hunting the wrong ghosts," Marcus snapped, his gaze finally snapping up to meet hers. "I think you've spent 10 years building a weapon to point at the ironworks, while the person who actually cut your hand and killed my father has been sitting at your table the whole time." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the lungs. Sloane didn't move, but the pulse in her neck was visible. She looked back at Jun-ho, whose fingers were beginning to twitch against the metal table. The prince was awake. He had been awake since Marcus entered the room. The serum hadn't just sharpened his blades, it had sharpened his hearing, turning every whisper into a roar. Junho sat up, the movement so sudden and silent it made Marcus jump back. The amber in his eyes was vivid now, burning through the dim light of the medical wing. He looked at Sloane, then at Marcus, then at his own scarred hands. The static in his brain was clearing, and beneath the chemical fog, a name was beginning to form. Not his own, but a name associated with the secret that had started the war. "Who?" Junho asked. His voice was a rasp, a sound of dry earth shifting. Sloane stood, her cane striking the floor with a definitive clack. "It doesn't matter who, Junho. The mission is the only thing that's real. The past is just a ledger of debts we can no longer collect." "It matters to me," Junho said, sliding off the table. He stood taller now, the broken prince persona completely discarded. He looked like a statue carved from the very iron that surrounded them. "You told me my family discarded me to pay a debt. You told me my sister signed my life away. But if the debt was a lie, then what am I?" "You are mine," Sloane said, her voice rising with a terrifying, maternal authority. "I built you from the scraps the world threw away. I gave you the strength to survive the people who murdered my family and sold yours. You are the only honest thing in this entire port." But the seeds of disillusionment had already taken root. Junho walked toward her, his movements no longer mechanical, but filled with a dark, burgeoning intent. He stopped just inches from her, looking down at the black-gloved hand. He remembered the tutor's son in the safe house. He remembered the secretary's last words. They hadn't been begging for their lives. They had been trying to warn him. "The secret in the marsh," Junho whispered. "The cargo on the freighter that crashed. It wasn't steel. It was a list of names. Onyx names. Men who were being paid by the ironworks to ensure the tugboat never reached the pier. My father didn't kill your husband, matriarch. He just paid the man who did." Marcus laughed, a jagged, hysterical sound. "You see, Ma? Even your pet knows the truth. The ironworks didn't pull the trigger. One of our own did. And now you've spent a decade training the very boy who's going to realize that we're the villains in his story, too." Sloane's right hand whipped out, the back of it striking Marcus across the face with enough force to send him sprawling against the medical cabinets. "Get out," she hissed, "before I decide that you're a liability I can no longer afford to." "Carrie." Marcus scrambled to his feet, blood leaking from his lip, his eyes full of a poisoned crown's spite. He looked at Junho, then back at his mother. "He's going to kill you, you know. You made him too good. You made him just like you. And eventually, a weapon always finds its way back to the person who sharpened it." When the door slammed behind Marcus, the room fell into a suffocating quiet. Junho didn't move. He stood in the center of the room, the amber in his eyes slowly fading into a cold, hard gray. The substitution was complete. He was no longer a prince, and he was no longer her son. He was something else entirely, a creature of pure utility that had just realized it was being used by two different monsters. Sloane reached out with her gloved hand, her fingers trembling slightly as she tried to touch his cheek. For the first time, Junho didn't flinch. He didn't react at all. He was as cold as the concrete outside. "I did it for you, Junho," she whispered, her voice breaking for the first and last time. I made you so the world could never hurt you again. No, Junho said, his voice flat and final. You made me so the world would be as lonely as you are. He turned and walked toward the door, his katanas leaning against the wall by the exit. He picked them up, the steel singing as it slid into the scabbards on his back. He didn't look back. He didn't ask for permission. He walked out into the savannah fog, a ghost, finally untethered from its grave. Sloane sat back down in her chair, the photograph of her family slipping from her fingers and fluttering to the floor. She looked at her paralyzed hand, the black leather reflecting the dim overhead light. The ghost in the docks was no longer a rumor. He was a reality she had birthed with her own hands. And as she watched the fog swallow the port, she realized that the debt wasn't being settled. It was merely changing hands. The boy was gone. The weapon was loose. And for the first time in 10 years, Matriarch Sloane felt a genuine, bone-deep fear. Not for her life, but for the world she had built, which was about to meet the edge of its own creation. The fog over the Savannah River didn't lift. It simply curdled, turning a bruised purple as the sun struggled to pierce the industrial smog. Junho stood at the edge of Pier 17, his boots balanced precariously on the rusted lip of the concrete. He wasn't looking at the water. He was looking at the way his own hands didn't shake, even as the focus serum began its jagged withdrawal. The withdrawal was supposed to be a punishment, a physical reminder of his dependence on the matriarch. But the cold clarity that followed the tremors was something the syndicate's chemists hadn't predicted. For the first time, he wasn't feeling through Sloane's nerves. He was feeling the salt air on his own skin, and it felt like a whetstone. The sound of a heavy luxury engine purred through the mist, the low hum of a vehicle that didn't belong in the graveyard of the docks. A white sedan, pristine and insulting, pulled to a stop 50 yards behind him. Silkan stepped out. She didn't have enforcers with her. She didn't need them. She carried the weight of the Goryeo name, a name that Junho now realized was just another layer of the shroud he'd been wrapped in since birth. You look different in the light, Junho, Silk said, her voice carrying easily over the slapping of the tide against the pilings. Sloane has done wonders with the raw material. You walk like a man who has forgotten how to bleed. Junho didn't turn around. He watched a piece of driftwood catch in an eddy, spinning uselessly before being pulled under. I haven't forgotten how to bleed. I've just forgotten why I should care when I do. Silk walked closer, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic tempo on the pavement. She stopped 10 feet away, her eyes raking over the syndicate-issue tactical gear he wore, the dual hilts rising over his shoulders. I didn't come here to play at sentiment. I saw what you did at the safe house. You were efficient. You were clinical. You were exactly what our father was too weak to make you. She paused, her gaze hardening. The matriarch's son is talking to us, Junho. Marcus is a small man with a large appetite for revenge. He told us about the serum. He told us about the secret you think you found. The secret is a lie, Junho said, finally turning to face her. The amber in his eyes was a dull, dying coal, but the stare behind it was more piercing than any chemical stimulant. The Onyx and the Goryeo didn't go to war over a ship. They went to war to hide the fact that they were already the same person. Silk smiled, a thin, razor-like expression. Business is business, little brother. The Saltwater Pact needed a sacrifice to keep the gears turning. You were the lowest valued asset in the portfolio. But now? Now you're the only asset that matters. Sloane has built a weapon she can't control, and Marcus is ready to. Hand me the keys to the Onyx Hub just to see her fall. I'm here to offer you a buyback. A buyback, Junho repeated, the words tasting like copper. Kill her, Silk said, the command as cold and flat as a ledger entry. Kill Matriarch Sloane tonight. Marcus will open the side gate for you. Once she's gone, the Ironworks will absorb the syndicate. You'll come home. We'll clean the chemicals out of your blood. We'll give you a title, a house in Seoul, and all the poetry you can read. You can go back to being a prince. Junho looked at his sister, the woman who had watched him being dragged away in a cage, and felt nothing but relief that her inheritance was secure. He looked at her white suit, unblemished by the grease of the port, and realized she was just as much an architect as Sloane, one built with steel and needles, the other built with silence and signatures. I'm not a prince, Junho said, his voice dropping into a register that made Silk's smile falter. And I don't think I like poetry anymore. It's too soft for the way the world actually works. Don't be a fool, Silk hissed, her composure fracturing. Sloane is using you to replace the son she failed. She doesn't see you. She sees a ghost she's trying to keep from dying twice. Marcus knows it. He's already leaking their shipping routes to our hunters. The Onyx Syndicate is a sinking ship, Junho. Don't go down with the woman who turned you into a monster. She didn't turn me into a monster, Junho said, stepping off the ledge of the pier and walking toward her. He moved with the terrifying, predatory grace of a creature that had been hunted so long it forgot how to be the prey. She just took away the blindfold you put on me. She showed me that in this port, you're either the person holding the blade or the person feeling it. You sold me to pay a debt, Silk, but you forgot one thing about debts. He stopped inches from her, the height difference making her look small for the first time in his life. He could smell her expensive perfume over the rot of the marsh, a scent that felt like a direct insult to the scars on his hands. What's that? Silk asked, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain the Iron Queen. Interest, Junho whispered. He didn't draw his swords. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough to make her take a step back, her heel catching on a crack in the concrete. In that moment, Silk realized that the buyback was a failure. The weapon wasn't for sale. It wasn't loyal to the Goryeo bloodline, and it certainly wasn't loyal to the matriarch. It was a self-sustaining entity of vengeance, fueled by the very erasure they had all worked so hard to achieve. Marcus is waiting, Junho said, his voice devoid of any familial warmth. Tell him I'm coming, but tell him I'm not coming for her. I'm coming for the ledger. Silk scrambled back into her car, the engine roaring to life as she fled the dead zone. She didn't look back. She didn't see Junho standing in the middle of the road, the fog closing in around him until he was nothing more than a silhouette. Inside the sedan, Silk's hands were shaking. She realized then that Sloane hadn't just built a weapon to protect the Onyx, she had built a catastrophe. Junho was caught between two mothers, but he had chosen a third path, the path of the void. Back at the Onyx Hub, Sloane sat in her control chair, her black-gloved hand twitching in a rhythmic, agonizing pulse. She watched the monitors, seeing the Goryeo sedan speed away from the perimeter. She knew what Silk had offered. She knew what Marcus was planning. She had lived her life by the logic of the port, and she knew that the seesaw was about to tip. He's coming home, isn't he? Marcus asked from the shadows behind her, his voice tight with a mixture of terror and anticipation. Sloane didn't answer. She looked at the photograph on her console, the one she had picked up from the floor. She slowly tore it in half, separating the husband from the son, and then dropped both pieces into the shredder. "He isn't coming home, Marcus," Sloane said, her voice sounding older than the rusted cranes outside. "He's coming to settle the accounts. And God help us, I'm the one who taught him how to count." The breach was no longer a physical threat from the outside. It was a structural collapse from within. As the lights in the hub flickered, signaling the first of Marcus's sabotages, Sloane gripped her cane. She had wanted a son who could survive the world. She had finally gotten him. And as the first sound of a dual-blade strike echoed from the loading docks, she realized that the greatest tragedy of her life wasn't that her family died. It was that she had survived long enough to see what she had replaced them with. The humidity in the Savannah port had reached a breaking point, the air so thick and heavy it felt like breathing through wet wool. A low-pressure system was crawling in from the Atlantic, but it brought no rain, only a static charge that made the hair on Matriarch Sloane's arms stand up. She sat in the high-backed command chair of the hub, her black-gloved hand resting on the console. The screens in front of her were flickering, bleeding static as Marcus's sabotage began to eat the Syndicate's internal network. She didn't need the cameras to tell her the perimeter had been breached. She could feel it in the phantom ache of her paralyzed fingers. The men who had taken her husband and her son weren't ghosts anymore. They were the Shadow Crows, a freelance liquidation squad that the Goryeo Ironworks had kept on a leash for 10 years. Now, Sil Khan had finally let them off. The first sound of the extraction wasn't a gunshot. It was the rhythmic thud, thud, thud of pressurized canisters being fired into the ventilation shafts. A pale, odorless gas began to roll across the floor of the hub, designed to neutralize the rank-and-file Onyx enforcers before they could draw their weapons. Sloane didn't move. She reached into her desk and pulled out a small, pressurized injector of the same amber focus serum she had used to forge Junho. She didn't hesitate. She slammed the needle into her thigh, the chemical fire instantly surging through her veins, forcing her heart to beat with a terrifying, artificial vigor. Her left hand, dormant for a decade, began to seize and twitch, the dead nerves screaming as the stimulant forced a temporary, jagged connection. "They're here, Ma," Marcus whispered, stumbling into the command center. He looked pathetic, his face pale and sweating, a submachine gun trembling in his hands. "The Crows, they're through the north gate. They aren't looking for the ledger. They're looking for us." Sloane looked at her son, and for the first time, she saw him clearly, not as a failure of her blood, but as a victim of her own inability to let go. "They're looking for me, Marcus," she said, her voice sounding younger, energized by the amber poison in her blood. "You were just the bait they used to keep me in the chair." Before Marcus could respond, the reinforced glass of the command center shattered inward. 3 figures in matte black tactical gear swung in on rappelling lines, their movements synchronized and silent. These were the men who had crippled her, the professionals who didn't miss. Sloane stood up, her cane clattering to the floor. She didn't need it anymore. Her right hand drew a heavy-caliber revolver from under the console, while her left, the black-gloved hand, slowly curled into a stiff, trembling fist. But she wasn't the first to strike. A flash of steel erupted from the shadows of the catwalks above. Junho descended like a falling star, his dual katanas slicing through the air with a sound like tearing silk. He didn't land. He transitioned from the air into a killing spin. The first crow was decapitated before his boots touched the floor. The second took a blade through the center of his chest, the steel protruding through his back as Jun-ho used the body as a shield against the third crow's fire. The weapon had returned, and he was no longer a shadow. He was the storm. Jun-ho stood in the center of the shattered glass, his eyes glowing a brilliant, violent amber. He looked at Sloane, and for a heartbeat, the matriarch saw the boy she had lost. Then, the look vanished, replaced by a clinical coldness that was entirely her own creation. He didn't move to protect her. He moved to eliminate the threats in the room. He was a machine executing a protocol. "The debt is being settled," Jun-ho said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to harmonize with the humming electronics of the hub. "Finish it, Jun-ho," Sloane commanded, her own vision beginning to blur as the focus serum pushed her blood pressure to the brink of a stroke. "The one in the lead, the one with the scarred throat. That's him. That's the man who took CJ." The lead crow stepped through the main doors, flanked by 4 more assassins. He removed his helmet, revealing a face mapped with the jagged scars of a life spent in the dark. He looked at Sloane, then at Jun-ho, and laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound. "You built a good one, matriarch. He moves just like his father did before we put him in the marsh. But you forgot the golden rule of the ironworks. Never build something you aren't prepared to kill." The lead crow raised a specialized, high-frequency blade, the steel shimmering with a deadly vibration. He moved with a speed that rivaled Jun-ho's, the two of them colliding in the center of the hub in a spray of sparks and flying metal. The sound was deafening, the high-pitched scream of steel on steel, punctuated by the heavy boom of Sloane's revolver as she picked off the supporting assassins from her elevated position. Marcus was frozen, tucked behind a server rack, watching the world he thought he understood be torn apart by the monsters his mother had cultivated. He saw Jun-ho take a shallow cut across the shoulder, the blood bright and red against his tactical gear. He saw the prince's eyes never once flicker with pain. Jun-ho was undergoing the final stage of erasure. He wasn't a man fighting a man. He was a function of violence seeking its natural end. Jun-ho's dual blades moved in a complex, interlocking pattern that Sloane recognized as the white gold style of the Goryeo royals, but twisted, made more efficient and brutal by her own training. He wasn't just using the steel. He was the steel. He parried a strike that would have severed his head, stepped into the lead crow's guard, and drove both katanas upward through the assassin's jaw. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of the lead crow's body sliding off the blades and hitting the concrete with a dull thud. Sloane slumped back into her chair, the focus serum beginning to crash. Her left hand went cold again, the temporary life fleeing from the fingers. She looked at Jun-ho, who was standing over the body of her enemy, his chest heaving, the amber in his eyes slowly receding to reveal a hollow, gray vacuum. He had done it. He had avenged a family he didn't know, and a woman who had broken him. But as Jun-ho turned to face her, he didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a word of comfort. He raised his right blade and pointed it at the matriarch. "The debt to your family is settled," Jun-ho said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "The assassins are dead. Your husband is avenged. Your son is honored." "Jun-ho," Sloane whispered, her hand reaching out, trembling. "Now," Jun-ho continued, stepping over the glass toward her, "we settle the debt for the boy you murdered to make me. We settle the debt for the prince you put in a cage. We settle the debt for the hands you broke. Marcus finally found his courage, or perhaps his desperation. He stepped out from the shadows, his gun aimed at the back of Junho's head. "Stay away from her! You're a dog, Junho, a stray dog we fed." Junho didn't even turn around. In a move that was too fast for Marcus to track, he spun, the flat of his blade catching Marcus across the temple, sending him into a deep, unconscious sleep. He didn't kill the son. He simply dismissed him. His focus remained entirely on the matriarch. Sloane looked at the blade pointed at her heart. She didn't feel fear. She felt a strange, twisted sense of completion. She had wanted a weapon that could survive anything, and she had succeeded so thoroughly that she had become the final obstacle in its path. She had turned him into a weapon, and now the weapon was doing exactly what it was designed to do: eliminate the last source of its pain. "I gave you everything, Junho," Sloane said, a single tear escaping her eye and disappearing into the gray of her hair. "You gave me a grave," Junho replied. "I'm just making sure you're the one who lies in it." The lights in the hub flickered and died, leaving them in the red glow of the emergency power. Outside, the first cracks of thunder finally rolled over the Savannah port, the rain beginning to fall at last, washing the salt and the grease into the marsh. Inside the darkness, the only thing visible was the faint, dying amber of the weapon's eyes as he closed the final gap. The rain finally came, but it wasn't the cleansing downpour of a storybook ending. It was a torrential, suffocating deluge that turned the port of Savannah into a blurred landscape of drowning iron and gray mud. Inside the ironworks' primary foundry, the air was a different kind of heavy, thick with the scent of molten ore and the dry, metallic heat of furnaces that roared like caged beasts. Junho stood on the iron grating of the central catwalk, his dual blades held low. The blood on his sleeves had been washed a pale pink by the rain outside, but the stains on his soul remained a deep, indelible black. Ahead of him, Silk Han stood in the center of the foundry floor, her white suit now smeared with the grime of the industrial floor. She wasn't alone. Beside her sat the chairman, their father, trapped in a wheelchair, his eyes clouded with cataracts and the slow rot of dementia. He didn't recognize the man standing before him. He didn't see the prince he had discarded. He only saw a shadow with amber eyes. "You should have stayed in the marsh, Junho," Silk said, her voice barely audible over the rhythmic thrum of the furnaces. Sloane made a mistake. She thought she was building a soldier for her war. She didn't realize she was just sharpening a knife for mine. Junho moved forward, his boots ringing out a hollow, metallic cadence against the grating. "The war is over, Silk. The crows are dead. Sloane is a ghost sitting in a chair. There's no one left to hide behind." "Hide?" Silk laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that was swallowed by the heat. "I'm not hiding. I'm waiting for the settlement. You think you're here for revenge? You think you're the hero of a tragedy? Look at him, Junho." She pointed a trembling finger at their father. "Look at the man who signed the papers. He didn't do it because Sloane threatened him. He did it because he was bored of you. He did it because a son who writes poetry is a liability in a world of steel." Junho stopped 10 feet from them. He looked at the chairman, searching for a spark of recognition, a hint of the father who had once taught him the stroke of a brush. He found nothing but a hollow vessel. The fragmentation of his own identity felt complete in that moment. He wasn't a son, and he wasn't a prince. He was a weapon that had outlived its purpose. The secret wasn't the names of the traitors, was it? Junho asked, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. The secret was the price. You didn't just give me to Sloane to settle a debt. You gave me to her to see if she could do what you couldn't. You wanted to see if a monster could be made from a scholar. Silk's expression shifted, the mask of the Iron Queen finally cracking to reveal a bottomless, predatory envy. And she succeeded, didn't she? Look at you. You're perfect. You're the most valuable asset the Goryeo bloodline has ever produced. And now, you're going to kill the chairman for me. You're going to settle the final inheritance. And then you're going to lead the ironworks back into the port. Together, we'll burn the onyx to the ground. The focus surged in Junho's blood. But it was different this time. It wasn't the cold, clinical calculation of the matriarch. It was a hot, searing clarity. He saw the logic of the port laid bare, a cycle of substitution and debt that only ended when the last person standing had nothing left to lose. I'm not leading anything, Junho said. He moved with a speed that made Silk gasp. He didn't strike her. Instead, he sheared the wheels off the chairman's chair with a single, precise arc of his right blade. The old man slumped to the floor, babbling in a language Junho no longer cared to understand. "What are you doing?" Silk screamed, backing away toward the edge of the molten slag pit. "I'm your blood. I'm the only thing you have left." "You aren't my blood," Junho said, his amber eyes fixed on her. "You're just another architect. And the problem with architects is that they never think about the weapon's perspective. The final confrontation wasn't a grand duel. It was a clinical execution of the world's logic. Silk reached into her jacket for a small, pearl-handled pistol, a lady's weapon, soft and useless. Junho didn't even use his blades. He caught her wrist, the carbon fiber pins in his fingers clicking as he applied a pressure that turned her bones to dust. As Silk fell to her knees, screaming into the roar of the furnaces, Junho turned to the chairman. The old man looked up at him then, and for a fleeting second, the fog in his eyes cleared. He saw the prince. He saw the dual blades. He saw the monster he had authorized. "Junho," the chairman whispered, his voice a ghost of the past. Junho raised his blade, the tip reflecting the orange glow of the molten iron. He remembered Sloane's voice. Grief is a whetstone. He remembered the black-gloved hand. He realized then that he was the mirror for everyone's failures. He was the son Sloane couldn't save. And he was the prince the chairman couldn't love. "Junho is dead," he said. He didn't kill the chairman. That would have been mercy, a redemptive act of closure. Instead, he turned and walked toward the exit, leaving his father and sister in the middle of the burning foundry. He left them with their steel and their secrets, trapped in a structure that was already beginning to collapse under its own weight. As he stepped out into the savannah rain, the amber in his eyes began to fade into a permanent, haunted gray. He had undergone the final substitution. He had replaced his heart with a blade. And in doing so, he had achieved the only thing the port truly respected: absolute, solitary utility. He didn't go back to the Onyx hub. He didn't go back to Sloan. He walked into the marsh, the water rising to meet his boots, the dual katanas still gripped in his hands. He had killed the man who was responsible for the death of Sloane's husband, just as she had wanted. He had dismantled the Goryeo dynasty, just as he had dreamed. But as he looked at his reflection in a pool of oily water, he didn't see a man. He saw a tool that had finished its task and was now waiting for the rust to take it. The irreversible loss wasn't his family or his title. It was the ability to feel the rain as anything other than a tactical disadvantage. He had become the weapon. And a weapon has no home. It only has a master. Or it has the silence. Jun-ho chose the silence. Back at the hub, Matriarch Sloane sat in her chair, watching the screens go dark one by one. She felt the weight of her black-gloved hand, colder than it had ever been. She had her victory. She had her port. But as she looked at the empty training floor below, she realized that the weapon had performed. She realized the irreversible loss of the night wasn't the inventory. It was the myth of the Han family's unity. "You think you can buy her?" Minho laughed, a sound tinged with hysteria. "I don't need to buy her," Jisoo said, signaling the men. "I just need to ensure she's part of the tragic accident involving the Gyeonggi electrical fire." Naomi moved before the first contractor could reach her. It wasn't a fight, it was an erasure of distance. She drove the crowbar into the lead-weighted crate, tilting it toward the lead man. As the heavy pallet tipped, she used the momentum to pivot, her blade finding the gap in the second man's vest. The struggle was brief and ugly. Power visibly changed hands when Naomi grabbed the high-voltage prod from the floor and turned it on the third man, the smell of ozone and burning fabric filling the air. She stood amidst the wreckage of the confrontation, her breathing shallow, her eyes fixed on Jisoo. "The logs," Naomi panted. "I didn't check them tonight. I checked them yesterday. I knew it was you." The secret was never the theft. It was Naomi's willingness to let it happen just to draw Jisoo into the open. The corruption of Naomi's soul was now complete. She was sacrificing the syndicate's assets to harvest its internal enemies. By the time the sun began to bleed a pale, sickly orange over the Gyeonggi horizon, the warehouse was a tomb of cold intentions. Minho sat on a crate of lead-filled batteries, his head in his hands. His sister was gone, fled into the gray morning, stripped of her access, but still a ghost in the machinery. This was the disillusionment. Minho realized that Naomi hadn't saved him. She had merely cleared the field so she could stand alone next to him. "She was my sister," Minho whispered. "She was a leak," Naomi corrected. She was wiping blood from her cheek with a piece of industrial gauze. In this world, family is just a vulnerability that hasn't been exploited yet. If you want to survive the next month, you have to treat her like a rival, not a sibling. The emotional attachment Minho felt for his sister was his greatest weakness, and the world, through Naomi's logic, punished him for it. He had lost his last tether to a normal life. They returned to the car, but the seating had changed. Naomi sat in the driver's seat this time. The ascension was no longer subtle. She was the one navigating the city's treacherous veins. "Where are we going?" Minho asked, his voice hollow. "To the chairman's bedside," Naomi said. "We need to finish the erasure. If your sister has any allies left, they'll go to him to authorize a formal removal of your status. We need to ensure his signature is no longer a factor." The core engine had shifted to time. They were racing against the dawn of a legal coup. As they sped back toward the city center, Naomi felt the final fragments of her old self, the woman who once believed in justice and the sanctity of life, flicker and go out. She looked at the rearview mirror. Min-ho looked like a ghost, a shell of a man being carried toward a throne he no longer wanted. He was the king, but she was the kingdom. They arrived at the private hospital wing as the city began to wake. The sterile corridors smelled of bleach and impending death. Outside the chairman's room, the air was static with the poisoned crown. Naomi didn't hesitate. She entered the room, the steady beep of the heart monitor the only sound. The old man looked fragile, a titan reduced to a collection of tubes and rhythmic pulses. "He's still the only one who can sign the emergency receivership papers," Min-ho said, standing in the doorway. "If he dies now, the company goes into a 3-year probate. We lose everything." "He doesn't need to die," Naomi said, her hand hovering over the tablet that controlled his sedation levels. "He just needs to become a substitution, a figurehead that speaks only through us." She began to adjust the settings, her fingers steady. She was hacking the medical interface, creating a loop where the chairman appeared stable but was effectively trapped in a chemically induced twilight. He would become a living seal of approval, a puppet for her and Min-ho to play. The irreversible loss was the chairman's dignity and, by extension, the last shred of Min-ho's respect for his father. As the sun finally cleared the skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the hospital room, Naomi stood back. The power had changed hands. The Han Guang wasn't a family business anymore. It was a ghost ship, steered by a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to be human. "It's done," she said. Min-ho looked at his father, then at Naomi. He saw the fragmentation of his world. He was no longer an heir. He was an accomplice. "What now?" he asked. Naomi walked past him, her footsteps echoing in the empty hall. "Now we find your sister, and we make sure she understands that the territory has changed." The chapter ended not with a bang, but with the cold, black-gloved hand.
"I can't read it," he said. "The words don't make sense anymore. But you should keep it. It's the only thing in this port that doesn't have a price." He turned and walked toward the elevator. The doors slid shut with a soft, final hiss. Sloane sat in the silence, the morning sun finally hitting the deck, casting long, distorted shadows. She reached out with her right hand and touched the book. The paper was yellowed and smelled of the marsh. She opened it to a random page, her eyes landing on a verse about a bird that forgets its song because it's too busy sharpening its beak. She looked at her left hand. It didn't move. It would never move again. The final silence had descended. She had her victory. The Goryeo family was erased, her husband was avenged, and her syndicate was the undisputed master of the Savannah port. She had everything she had ever fought for, and as she looked out at the empty, shimmering river, she realized she had never been more defeated. The prince was gone, disappearing into the fog of the coast, a ghost among ghosts. The matriarch remained, a statue in a high-backed chair, watching the tide go out. The seesaw had stopped moving. The poisoned crown was heavy. And in the port of Savannah, the only thing louder than the machinery was the sound of a debt that had finally, mercifully, been paid in full.